Top 20 Bakery Worker Interview Questions and Answers. Bakery workers bake bread, biscuits, cakes, pastries, pies, crackers, and many other items in industrial, institutional, and commercial bakeries. They help in the production of baked items and also in the serving of customers. If you want to join this profession, you will be asked a series of questions that you must answer in the most appropriate way to get into the job position. Let's go through some of these questions and the tips for tackling them. 1. Why are you interested in this role? Tip number 1. The interviewer wants to know what sparks your interest in this particular role. Tip number 2. Talk about the personal inclination you have towards this role. Answer: I have always loved the idea of working in a bakery. The art of baking and serving people with dessert and pastries has been my most ideal dream. I have grown up imagining about icing a beautiful cake or baking a cream roll into the fluffiest shape. Baking is an art, and I want to be an artist. 2. What are the roles of a bakery worker? Tip number 1. The interviewer wants to know how much experienced you are in this role. Tip number 2. Show him that you know the fundamental roles of a bakery worker. Answer: being a bakery worker, I have worked in many bakeries. I have summed up a few typical roles that every bakery worker is assigned. These include packaging of baked items, maintaining a clean surrounding in the bakery, communicate with the customers, inspect and count the products, and assist the head baker. 3. What are the qualities that a bakery worker should possess to be effective? Tip number 1. The interviewer wants to know what qualities you think a successful bakery worker must have. Tip number 2. Mention the qualities that you possess as well. Answer: a bakery worker must have a few unique qualities that will make him an excellent worker. He must be organized to maintain a clean work surrounding. One must have strong communication skills, attention to detail, creativity and curiosity, and patience to be a good bakery worker. 4. What major challenges did you face during your last role? Tip number 1. Mention the challenges briefly and highlight your coping mechanism. Tip number 2. Show the interviewer that you know how to face challenges and how to overcome them. Answer: the challenges I faced in my previous role is that I did not have the right time to look after myself. As I had to start very early and end very late in my work days, the routines were rigid. But that was not a big deal to me, as working in a bakery is what I love, and I'm ready to give it my very best. I created time during the weekends to watch my favorite shows. 5. Describe your daily routine as a bakery worker. Tip number 1. The interviewer wants to know if you are experienced enough to do this role. Tip number 2. Mention a workday when you were highly skilled and efficient. Answer: being a bakery worker, I had to start very early. Making yeasted bread and then finalizing other products as well took my best efforts. I baked fresh bread loaves daily, set out the pastries, and prepared fresh bread and other items for the day ahead at the business's closure. 6. Describe briefly about your bakery worker experience. Tip number 1. The interviewer wants to know how well you did in the past. Tip number 2. Mention your likes and dislikes if any of these roles. Answer: I have been lucky to work in several bakeries ever since I began my career. I have gained extensive experience in using all manner of baking machines. I can take records perfectly and bake several loaves at a time, thanks to some of the places I have worked in. 7. What kind of strategies and mindset is required for this role? Explain with example. Tip number 1. The interviewer wants to know if you have some unique strategies for this role or not. Tip number 2. Mention the strategy you have been using in your previous work position. Answer: I believe that the ideal way of working in a bakery is to deal with things proactively and perfectly. The mindset needed for this job is perfectionism and attention to detail. One can always be good at his work in a bakery if he is ready to accept feedback and is inclined towards giving his best to his work. Though it is tiring, it is always needed to not focus on this part of the job. 8. What is the biggest challenge that you foresee in this job? Tip number 1. the interviewer wants to know what challenges you in this role. Tip number 2, mention that challenges help you improve at work. Answer: I have noticed that you have a set threshold to meet at the end of the day, which is good. However, this may be quite overwhelming if one employee calls sick. I believe that we can come up with a way of solving that. 9. How do you stay motivated at work? Tip number 1, show the interviewer that your motivation comes from working well. Tip number 2, the interviewer wants to know how well you can work and what motivates you to achieve your goals. Answer: I consider myself a perfectionist and therefore, huge on results. My motivation is derived from within. I give my all to ensure that I have achieved what I set out to at the beginning of the day. I also love beating deadlines. 10. Describe a time you failed in this role and the lesson you learned. Tip number 1, the interviewer wants to know if there are times when you failed and if you are honest about it or not. Tip number 2, talk about the times you failed and mention what you learned from it. Answer: at times, failure is a part of every work environment, and I believe it is better to accept the mistakes and learn a positive message from them. At a given point, I stepped in for a former worker and realized late that he did not mix the dough well enough, resulting in very dry puffs. This taught me to always be on the lookout and strive to achieve perfection. 11. Can you work under pressure? Tip number 1, give examples of how you handled stress and work pressure. Tip number 2, the interviewer wants to know if you can work in a pressure-filled new surrounding. Answer: yes. I believe that anyone can handle stressful situations if they take everything easy. Once we had a load of customers on a Saturday night, we also had a big order of a birthday cake. We had to manage everything, and I was responsible for cake baking. I kept my brain calm and worked everything out in a very gentle manner. 12. Are you ready to start your job very early in the morning? Tip number 1, the interviewer wants to know about the dedication you have regarding this role. Tip number 2, mention your ability to work in the defined time frames. Answer: I have read the job description quite carefully, and I'm ready to take on all the duties and responsibilities that this role brings at any time of the day. I would love to come to the bakery at that early hour of the day and maintain a balance in my life and work needs. 13. What are your favorite methods you use as a baker? Tip number 1, give concrete examples of baking techniques you use. Tip number 2, be confident in answering this question. Answer: I am terrific at proofing bread needed for baking and have all of my preferred set of tools in the kitchen. This is my favorite part of baking. 14. Tell me about the ways you use to prioritize, organize, and plan the work you do for baking. Tip number 1, show the interviewer that you have strong organizing skills. Tip number 2, mention the way you used to work well in your previous work role. Answer: I am a perfectionist by nature, and I have to be early at work to keep up with my professional mindset. I start by listing out the priorities I need at work. Then I plan how I will execute everything and then start doing the work that needs to be done first. 15. Mention a method you have utilized to make sure the tools and equipment you use meet the health regulations. Tip number 1, show the interviewer that you realize that you need to fall fit on the health and safety regulations. Tip number 2, the interviewer wants to know your health and safety prioritizations. Answer: one method that I use is wearing cutting gloves while dealing with sharp kitchen tools and equipment. I keep many such gloves by my side to make sure I work safely. And for the health part, I maintain cleanliness in my working surroundings and always make sure I follow all health standards. 16. Are you a team worker? Tip number 1, the interviewer wants to know if you can work well in a team. Tip number 2, highlight the times when you performed well while being a team member. Answer: I am always a team worker, given that as a bakery worker, I cannot work alone and produce high-quality goods. I have worked in many bakeries, and I know that working with a team produces efficient results. 17. Give an example of when you showed leadership skills. Tip number 1, the interviewer wants to know if you can work under stress without supervision. Tip number 2, highlight your leadership skills. You can even go ahead and give an experience. Answer: once my manager was sick and he couldn't come to work. This was a scenario where we were on our own. I stepped up and used my leadership abilities to conduct things the way they were needed, to keep producing quality baked items and serve customers on time. 18. How do you deal with rude customers? Tip number 1, you need to show a high level of professionalism. Tip number 2, highlight your ability to work in such a situation. Answer: I know it is very typical to come across rude customers. I have always worked in many kinds of work surroundings, and I know how to deal with people who are not as kind as the rest. Maintaining a calm attitude and a very soothing tone are the best ways to deal with them. 19. Are you able to work fast? Tip number 1, the interviewer wants to know if you can work in a fast and demanding environment. Tip number 2, mention your skills of working in any workplace. Answer: I have been working in bakeries, and there were many times I had to deliver fast results. As I have a calm personality, I can manage things well by prioritizing things the way they are needed to be done. I love that even though things will get stressful at times, I still get to practice my problem-solving skills. 20. How efficient are you in getting a wrong order done right? Tip number 1, the interviewer wants to see your problem-solving skills. Tip number 2, show the interviewer how efficient you are in doing things right. Answer: I have always been in places where I would get very creative and custom-make bakery item orders. There was a time when someone added extra sugar to my recipe, and I had to look after this situation. I worked fast and prepared a new cake mix and started making the cake from that. It gets stressful, but I can manage such things well. Conclusion. These were a few questions that are asked in bakery work or job interviews. Through the given tips, you can come up with more answers and get the job you are looking for, or use the answers given in each. Also, remember to tackle all the questions thoughtfully. Most interviewers look at how you answer the problem, and not even the words that come out of your mouth. Ensure that you are perfect.